Nobody in Harrow's Bend talked about Samuel Whitfield the way they talked about other men. They didn't gossip about his gambling or his temper, or the fact that he drank too much on Saturday nights. What they said about Samuel was quieter than that, and somehow harder to shake. They said he was a man who had learned to live without expecting anything. That was not a small thing to say about a person. In a town like Harrow's Bend, where everyone knew the weight of a dry season and the particular silence of an empty house, it was almost a kind of verdict. Samuel Whitfield had turned 33 in March. He ran 42 acres of wheat land east of the creek, the same land his grandfather had broken and his father had nearly broken himself trying to hold. The soil was good. The work was relentless. The house had 3 rooms and a porch that tilted slightly to the left, and if you sat on it long enough at the right hour, the evening light came across the fields in a way that made you understand why a man might spend his whole life on a piece of ground like this. He had been engaged once. Her name was Catherine, and she had been kind and pretty and entirely unsuited to the kind of life the land required. She had left in the 2nd year without cruelty and without much explanation, and Samuel had not blamed her. He had understood it in the way that a man understands a thing he wishes were different but cannot argue with. That had been 4 years ago. Since then he had worked and been quiet and not thought too carefully about the future, because the future, when he looked at it directly, had the quality of a horizon that moves away from you as you walk toward it. What changed it was a letter from his cousin Walter. Walter lived in the city now and wrote occasionally with the breezy confidence of a man who had solved a problem and wanted others to benefit from his solution. The letter was 3 pages long and concerned itself mostly with a service Walter had read about in a periodical, a correspondence service, for people in circumstances like Samuel's. Samuel read the letter twice and then set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for 4 days. He was not a man who moved quickly toward things he wasn't sure about. He was also not a man who pretended something wasn't in front of him when it plainly was. On the 5th day, he sat down and wrote a letter to the address Walter had included, and the letter said, in the plain language of a man who had no patience for pretense, exactly what he was and what he was offering and what he was not. He was a farmer. The work was hard and the seasons were unforgiving, and the house was modest, and the nearest town was 11 miles on a good road and 14 when the rains came. He was not a man of great words or great gestures. He was steady. He was honest. He did not drink to excess, and he intended to keep the land. What he was looking for was a woman who could look at all of that and not flinch. He did not expect a reply. He sent the letter anyway. He received 3 responses over the following weeks. 2 of them he read carefully and set aside with a quiet respect for the women who had written them, but a sense that something essential was not there. The 3rd letter he read standing at the kitchen window with the morning light coming in flat and cold, and when he finished it, he read it again. And then she sat down. Her name was Clara Voss. She wrote from a town called Millbrook, which was a day and a half east by train. Her handwriting was plain and even, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write efficiently and had never seen the need to make it decorative. She was 30 years old. She had been keeping her widowed father's household for 6 years, and before that she had worked 2 seasons in a dry goods store and 1 summer in a cannery. She was not writing, she said, because she was desperate. She was writing because she had looked at the next 10 years, and they looked very much like the last 10 years, and she was not certain she could bear that. She said she had no illusions about what a practical arrangement meant. She understood it was not a romance. She understood it was an agreement between 2 people who needed something the other had. Then she said something that Samuel read 3 times before he put the letter down. She wrote, "I have kept other people's homes my whole life. I would like, before I am old, to keep one of my own. I am not asking for love. I am asking for the chance to be somewhere that is mine to tend." Samuel sat with that sentence for a long time. He wrote back the same evening. His letter was short. He said she was welcome to come and see the place before any decision was made. He said the train fare would be covered either way, arrival or departure. He said she was under no obligation. He sent the letter and went back to work and told himself he had handled it sensibly and did not think about it further. He thought about it considerably. Clara Voss read Samuel Whitfield's reply at the small desk in the corner of her father's parlor, in the house where she had lived every year of her life, except the 3 she had spent in other employ. The parlor smelled of pipe tobacco and old wool, and the particular stale warmth of a room that was rarely open to fresh air. She had stopped noticing it years ago. She had not written to the correspondence service on impulse. She had thought about it for a long time in the way she thought about most things, slowly and without dramatics, turning the question over until she could see all its sides. She was a practical woman. She had been practical since she was 12 years old and understood that practicality in her circumstances was not a quality but a requirement. What she had allowed herself to want, in the small private space of her own mind where practicality did not always have to govern, was something that felt like ground, something that did not shift under her when she put her weight on it. She had read Samuel Whitfield's letter several times. What struck her was not what he said, but what he didn't say. He didn't promise anything. He didn't describe the land in flattering terms or the house in terms designed to impress. He said it was modest. He said the work was hard. He said the road was sometimes bad in the rains. A man who described things accurately was a man you could trust to do the same later. She wrote back that she would arrive on the Thursday train. Samuel was at the station early. He told himself this was practical, that he had errands in town, and the timing happened to work. He had no errands in town. He stood near the wagon and watched the tracks and turned his hat in his hands and was honest enough with himself to recognize what he was doing, even if he wasn't entirely comfortable with it. The train came in at 11:15. He recognized her before she reached the bottom of the platform steps. Not because she had described herself in her letter, she hadn't, but because of the way she moved. There was no performance to it. She wasn't looking around to see if she was being watched or arranging her expression for arrival. She stepped off the train and looked at the station and looked at the town and looked at the wagon and looked at him, and then she walked toward him with the direct and unhurried pace of a woman who had decided to go somewhere and had gone. She was not what he had pictured. He wasn't sure what he had pictured. She was medium height, brown-haired, with a face that was composed rather than beautiful, but had something in it that was better than either, a quality of attention, of being genuinely present to what was in front of her. She carried one bag. She did not seem to find this remarkable. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. They shook hands. Hers was firm and brief. She looked at him the way you look at something you are assessing honestly, without either hope or suspicion. "The wagon's just here," he said. She nodded and followed him to it, and they drove out of town in the direction of the farm. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have not yet found the shape of their conversation but are not troubled by the search. She asked about the land first. He appreciated that. She wanted to know the acreage, the crop rotation, the quality of the well. She asked about the nearest school, which he noted without comment. She asked whether the creek ran true in dry years or whether it was seasonal. "It runs about 8 months," he said. "The other 4 you pull from the well." She nodded, as if adding this to a list she was compiling. The house came into view as they crested the last low rise before the farm. He had spent 3 evenings that week cleaning it, and then felt faintly stupid for having done so, and then decided it didn't matter how he felt about it because the house was cleaner either way. She looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "The roof line is good," she said finally. He glanced at her. "Some houses," she said, "you can see where they've been fighting themselves for years. Walls that don't agree with the roof. Additions that pull in the wrong direction." She paused. "This one looks like it knows what it is." Samuel did not answer immediately. He was looking at his house through her eyes and finding that it was a different thing than what he saw when he looked at it alone. Not worse, just more itself. More visible, more present. It's been in the family a long time, he said. That shows, she said, in the good way. He parked the wagon and helped her down and showed her the place in the practical order of a man giving a tour rather than a performance. The house first, then the kitchen, then the well, then the barn and the equipment and the fields. She asked questions that were real ones. She did not make conversation. She looked at everything carefully, and what she said was either useful or silent. By the time they came back to the porch, something between them had settled into a kind of careful ease, not warmth yet, but a recognition. Two people who had established that they were not going to waste each other's time. She stayed 3 days. She had said she might stay too. The first evening they sat at the kitchen table after supper and talked about the arrangement in the plain language of a business agreement, because that was what it was. Terms, expectations, what each of them was offering and what they were not, Samuel said. I can offer stability and honest work and a house that is yours to run as you see fit. I can offer fair treatment and respect. I cannot offer more than I know how to give, Clara said. I can offer everything a household and a farm requires. I am not afraid of the work. I am not looking to be managed or kept or entertained. I want to be useful and to have something that is mine. They agreed on the terms. They shook hands across the kitchen table the way two people seal a sensible arrangement, and it was fine, exactly what it was supposed to be. Right up until Clara asked a question that wasn't part of any arrangement. She said, "The woman before, what happened?" It wasn't said cruelly. It was said the way she asked everything, directly, with genuine attention. Like she wanted to understand the ground before she stood on it. Samuel was quiet for a moment. She wasn't suited to it, he said finally. The life here, Clara looked at him. Just that, just looked, in the way she had of looking at things she was considering. And after a moment she said, "That's a partial answer." He didn't deny it. She didn't press. She simply held the space where the rest of the answer would have been. And Samuel understood, without fully knowing why, that she had heard the part he hadn't said. The second morning she asked to see the account ledger. He put it in front of her without a word. She went through it the way she probably went through everything, methodically, without hurry. He stood at the counter and watched her, and did not make conversation. When she finished, she didn't offer sympathy and didn't offer false encouragement. She tapped one column with her finger and said, "You're overpaying for seed stock. There's a supplier in Deering that runs 15% cheaper and has the same grade." He looked at the column. "You're carrying the equipment maintenance as a single line," she said. "If you split it out by type, you'll see where the cost is actually coming from. Right now you're guessing." He looked at the next column. She closed the ledger and pushed it back toward him. "The land is good," she said. "The rest is just attention." Samuel picked up the ledger. He had known some of this. He had known it in the vague, pressured way that a man alone knows things he has no one to think through with him. Hearing it said plainly, without judgment, by someone who had no investment in sparing him, was a different thing entirely. "You've looked at a lot of ledgers," he said. "6 years of my father's," she said. "You learn." He put the ledger away and said quietly, "You can call me Samuel. If we're going to talk about the accounts, Mr. Whitfield seems like the wrong distance." She looked up from the table with an expression that was not quite amusement. "All right," she said. She said his name that evening for the first time, asking him to pass the salt at supper. It was a small and entirely ordinary thing. Samuel Whitfield noticed it with the startling precision of a man who has been living in silence long enough to hear the difference. On the third morning she was up before him. He came into the kitchen and she was already there, 2 cups on the table and water on for coffee, moving around the room with the easy efficiency of someone who had simply decided where things were and gotten on with it. He stood in the doorway and looked at this and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for. She looked up. "Coffee's almost ready," she said. "The eggs need gathering if you're going that way." He went to gather the eggs. He stood in the henhouse for a moment longer than necessary, looking at nothing in particular, with the feeling of a man who has seen something he was not prepared for and is only now beginning to understand what it was. They married 6 weeks later. On a Wednesday morning, the Reverend came to the farm. That had been Clara's quiet preference expressed once without argument, and Samuel had arranged it without making a point of it. His neighbor, Albert Crane, and Albert's wife Frances served as witnesses. Frances cried during the vows, which she seemed to find embarrassing, and which Clara found unexpectedly touching. The ceremony was brief, 12 minutes from the first words to the last. Clara wore a dress the color of rain-washed slate, practical and clean and not trying to be anything other than what it was. Samuel had pressed his good shirt the night before, with such care that the crease was still sharp at noon. They said the words seriously, in the plain way of people who understand that the words mean something and do not need theater to prove it. Afterward, Frances Crane pressed both of Clara's hands and said something low and earnest that made Clara smile in a way Samuel had not seen from her yet, open and unguarded there and then gone. He didn't ask what had been said. He put the smile away instead, the way you put away something you don't yet understand but suspect you will need later. That evening they ate supper as they had every evening of her visit, except that the house felt different. Not heavier, just different, the way a room feels after something in it has been moved. The same room and not. He washed the dishes. She dried them. Neither had suggested this. It simply happened. And when the last dish was on the shelf, and the water was poured out, and she reached past him to hang the towel on its hook, they were standing very close together in the small kitchen, and both of them were aware of it, and neither of them moved away. "Good night, Samuel," she said. "Good night, Clara," he said. She went down the hall. He stayed in the kitchen a while, listening to the house settle in the dark, with the feeling of a man who has done something that cannot be undone and is only beginning to understand the full dimension of it. Not with regret. With something stranger and less nameable, Harrow's Bend had opinions. It was not a cruel town, but it was an attentive one, and a woman who had arrived on the Thursday train and married Samuel Whitfield inside 2 months was a thing worth noting. What they said, mostly, was that it was a practical arrangement. Said with varying degrees of warmth, depending on who was saying it. Edna Marsh, who kept the post office and considered herself the town's unofficial conscience, told anyone who sat still long enough that the woman had come from a correspondence service, that she'd been, as Edna put it, sent for. The way you sent for a catalog item. Clara heard this secondhand from Frances Crane, who delivered the information with the apologetic wince of someone who feels bad being the messenger, and delivers it anyway, because not knowing seemed worse. Clara's response was to walk into the post office the following Monday, mail a letter, purchase a sheet of stamps, ask Edna Marsh's opinion of the new road situation and the quality of this year's apple crop, and leave without mentioning a single word of what had been said about her. It was a thing done so cleanly and with such perfect natural ease that Edna Marsh found herself, against her will and considerable resistance, impressed. Frances Crane told her husband about it twice that evening. Samuel heard about it from Albert and said nothing. But something in his face changed in a way that Albert noticed and decided not to comment on. What Samuel had not accounted for, in all the practical clarity of the arrangement, was how quickly he would begin to anticipate ordinary things, the sound of her in the kitchen before he came in from the early chores, the way she sat with a book in the evenings, entirely absorbed, one finger keeping her place even when she wasn't turning pages. The questions she asked that were always real questions, never small talk, the kind that required him to think before answering. She asked about his grandfather once, carefully, the way she asked things she genuinely wanted to know. He told her more than he had intended to, more than he had told anyone, about the man and the land and the way the two of them were tangled up in his mind, until he could barely think of one without the other. She listened without filling the silences with reassurance, which was the right thing to do, and which not everyone understood. He found himself talking to her about the land in ways he had never talked about it before. Not the management of it. She already knew the management. But the feeling of it. The particular quality of the light over the east field in the late afternoon of a clear September. The smell of the soil in the first week after autumn rain. The way the wheat moved in a south wind. She listened to all of it. And then, one evening, sitting on the porch in the cooling dark, she said quietly that she had spent so long in places that belonged to other people that she had stopped being able to imagine what it would feel like to be somewhere that was hers. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "This place is yours," he said. "Same as it is mine." He had not planned to say it. He hadn't planned the words or the moment. They had simply been true and available, and he had said them. Clara looked out at the dark field. When she looked back, her face was composed as it nearly always was, but something underneath the composure had shifted, something that had been held carefully in place for a very long time. Neither of them named it. It was too new for names. 3 days later, Samuel came back from the north fence at midday to find Clara in the narrow strip of ground along the east wall of the house. She had been out early that morning, and he hadn't paid attention to where. Now he saw what she had done. She had turned the earth and set in a row of kitchen herbs along the wall and staked out a wider plot beyond them, and was kneeling in the turned dirt with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, completely absorbed. She didn't hear him come around the corner. He stopped and watched her. She had her hair pinned back and her hands dark with soil, and she was frowning at a stubborn root, with the focused annoyance of someone accustomed to problems that could be solved with enough patience. She looked entirely herself, unself-conscious and present, and like a person who had decided she belonged somewhere and had set about the business of belonging. He watched her for a moment longer than he meant to. She must have sensed him because she looked up. Their eyes met, and in the half-second before either of them said anything, something passed between them that was not part of any agreement they had made. Clara looked back down at the garden. Samuel went inside. Neither mentioned it at supper. But that night, lying awake in the dark, listening to the wheat move in the wind outside the window, Samuel Whitfield understood with the slow and unavoidable certainty of a man who has been trying not to understand something that he was in considerable difficulty. He had made a practical arrangement. The arrangement had become something else entirely without his permission. The question was whether it had done the same for her, and he had no idea how to ask without risking the only thing that had begun to feel in a long time. Like enough, he did not say anything for 9 days. Samuel was not a man who acted on feeling before he understood it, and what he was feeling did not lend itself to easy understanding. It lived in small and specific places. The way he turned his chair slightly toward her at supper without noticing. The way a conversation with her about something as unremarkable as the fence posts left him more settled than a full night's sleep. The way he listened for her footsteps in the morning before he was fully awake. He worked harder those 9 days than he had in months. He rose earlier and stayed out later, and told himself it was the season and the work and the list of repairs that never shortened. He told himself a number of things that were technically true and fundamentally dishonest. Clara, for her part, noticed. She noticed the way she noticed most things, quietly and without announcement. She went about her days with the same composed steadiness she brought to everything. The house and the garden and the accounts, and the 2 mornings that week she had ridden out with him to check the south fence, sitting a horse better than he had expected, which by now he had decided he should stop being surprised by. She was competent at everything she turned her attention to, and she turned her attention to the farm the way she turned it to everything else, completely, without performance, as if it had already mattered to her for years. That was the thing, Samuel thought, working the same stretch of fence he had been working for the better part of an afternoon, and probably not doing it very well. It wasn't any single moment, it was the accumulation of them. The evidence, building day by day, of a woman who was genuinely and without agenda and irreversibly here. It was Frances Crane who cracked it open. She came on a Tuesday with preserves, and the particular energy of a woman who has something to say and has been waiting for the right occasion. She sat at the kitchen table and talked about small things for 20 minutes while Samuel worked on the porch within earshot, until Frances said, in the unhurried voice of someone steering toward a point she had planned all along, that Clara had changed the place. Different how? Clara said. Like a house that's been empty, Frances said, even when it's been kept fine. You know when something's living in it. On the porch, Samuel drove the nail he was holding with considerably more force than the board required. He heard Clara say something quiet in response, too low to catch. He sat back on his heels and looked out at the yard and felt the back of his neck go warm. Frances left an hour later. Samuel came inside. Clara was at the stove. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and did not say anything for a moment, because every version of what he might say had the wrong shape for what he actually meant. She turned. He said, "Are you?" and stopped. He said, "Is this? Are you all right here? Is this enough?" He was aware it was not eloquent. He watched her face move through something he couldn't fully read. Something careful and then less careful and then very still. She said, "Are you asking if I'm content?" He said, "I'm asking something more than that." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the evening wind was moving through the wheat, and the last of the light was going gold across the floor, and neither of them moved. Clara set down what she was holding. She turned to face him fully, and for once her composure wasn't a wall, it was just her, clear and still and present, looking at him the way she looked at the ledger or the land or anything else she was deciding whether to trust. "I have spent a long time," she said, "being careful not to want things." She paused. "I think I have been careful long enough." It was the most she had given him. He understood that. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stood in front of her and looked at her plainly, with nothing held back, and said her name once quietly, the way you set something down that you have been carrying for longer than was good for you. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. Just that. Just her hand, warm and steady and entirely certain. He covered her hand with his. They stood there in the kitchen while the light moved across the floor, and nothing needed to be said, and nothing was. The garden along the east wall came in fully by late August. Clara had planted it in a practical order, herbs closest to the kitchen door, root vegetables in the longer rows, but there were flowers too, a strip of them along the fence. Tucked in among the useful things, she had allowed herself that. A small extravagance, the kind that costs nothing and means everything. Samuel brought her a second lantern for the porch without mentioning it. It appeared one evening, set on the railing at the angle that cast the best reading light, and Clara looked at it for a moment and then sat down and opened her book and did not say anything, and neither did he. They talked more easily now. The careful negotiated distance of those first weeks had not disappeared so much as it had transformed into something that knew the shape of itself, a closeness that had earned its ease, that knew the other person's silences and was not troubled by them. Samuel told her things he hadn't told anyone, about his father and what the man had given him and what he had failed to give him, and how those two things lived in the same complicated space. About the years after Catherine left, and what those years had done to his understanding of what he was willing to hope for. Clara told him things she had stopped believing anyone would want to hear. About her mother's death and the years that followed, about the particular loneliness of being indispensable and invisible at the same time. About the 10 years in her father's house that had been fine and adequate and profoundly not enough. These were not perfect confidences. Some things stayed private, as they should, but they were real ones. And that was rarer than it sounded. The town adjusted its opinion gradually, in the way towns do when reality insists on being better than the rumor. Edna Marsh, who had said what she said about the correspondence service, found herself 3 months later asking Clara Whitfield for advice on managing the post office accounts, which had gotten into a complicated state. Clara sorted them out in an afternoon. After that, Edna's opinions on the matter became more nuanced, Albert Crane told Samuel over a fence line in October that Clara was the best thing to happen to the Whitfield farm in memory, which was not a romantic statement and was not meant as one, but was offered with genuine feeling. Samuel smiled at that. A real smile, the kind people in Harrow's Bend had not seen from him in some time. Albert noticed and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. The first hard frost came in November, earlier than expected. Samuel came in from covering the remaining plants to find Clara already at the stove and the kitchen warm and the table set, and she handed him a cup, without a word, and he sat down at the kitchen table and held it with both hands and felt, with the steady certainty of a man who has stopped needing to argue with himself, that this was right. Not perfect. The work was still hard, and the seasons were still unforgiving, and the house still tilted slightly to the left on the porch side, and probably always would, but right. The specific rightness of a thing that has found its proper shape. That evening they sat by the stove after supper, and Clara read, and Samuel worked through the accounts for the following year, and every so often one of them said something, and the other answered, and there was no effort in it. No performance, no maintenance of any distance. At some point, Clara set her book down and said, "I've been thinking about the south field." He looked up the rotation, she said. "If you shift the wheat 1 year and put in clover before you go back to grain, you'll get better yield in the 3rd year. It takes patience, but it works out." He considered this. "I read it in a farming almanac I found at the Cranes," she said. "But the principle makes sense to me." He nodded slowly. He'd thought about something similar. Hadn't gotten around to running the numbers. He pulled the ledger toward him and she moved her chair slightly closer, and they went through it together, the lamp between them casting the same light on both their faces. Two people bent over the same problem with the same interest in solving it. Later, much later, when the fire had burned low and the accounts were put away and the house was quiet, he looked at her and thought about the letter he had written to the correspondence service, and the letter she had written back, and the train she had taken, and the 3 days and the 6 weeks, and all of it, the whole accumulation of it, and felt something that did not have a neat name but was entirely and completely sufficient. He reached across and took her hand. She turned it over and held his. They sat like that for a while, not talking, while the wind came down from the north and moved through the wheat outside, and the house held them, warm and tilted and entirely enough. The following spring, Francis Crane arrived with a basket and an expression that was working too hard at being casual. She sat at the kitchen table and talked about the weather and the road conditions and the price of seed, and then said, with the air of someone getting to the point they had planned to get to from the start, that she had heard something, and she wanted to say that she was very happy for them both. Clara, standing at the counter, looked at her with the expression of a woman who knows exactly what has been heard and has made her peace with it being known. Samuel came in from the barn a few minutes later and found the two of them at the kitchen table with the basket open between them, and Francis looked at him with enormous, unconvincing innocence, and he looked at his wife, and Clara looked back at him with an expression that was trying to be reproachful and not entirely succeeding. He leaned in the doorway and felt the particular and precise joy of a man who had written a letter expecting nothing and received instead everything that mattered. He had paid almost nothing to marry her. The correspondence fee, the train fare, a letter that had cost him more in honesty than it had in postage. What she had given him in return was not something you could put in a ledger. She had given him someone to think alongside. Someone who looked at the land and saw what he saw, not the difficulty of it and not the romance of it, but the real thing, the actual ground. Someone who said what she meant and meant what she said, and had looked at everything he was and found it worth staying for. He had not known before her that that was the thing he had been missing. He had thought the missing thing was something he could not name and probably could not have. He had been wrong about that. She looked at him across the kitchen, over Francis's elaborate attempt at innocence, and the look she gave him was the same one she had given him standing in the yard the first day, steady and clear and real. He straightened up from the doorway and came inside. Whatever Francis had brought in the basket smelled good. The morning light came through the kitchen window the way it always did this time of year, flat and golden and slowly warming. Clara put the kettle on. He sat down. And if you are hearing this story somewhere quiet, in whatever corner of the world this has reached you, whether it is morning or evening or the long middle of a night that won't quite end, I hope you know that this kind of thing is real, that it happens, that two people can begin with nothing more than honesty and a willingness to show up, and find, somewhere in the ordinary days between the first letter and the first frost, something that is more than either of them had thought to ask for. That's the thing about practical arrangements. Sometimes they become the most impractical thing of all. The thing that can't be measured or planned or written into any agreement. The thing that, when you finally set it down and let it be what it is, turns out to have been there in the room all along, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be enough.